Oxygen explanation for yawning is wrong. It has been wrong since at least 1987, when Robert Provine at the University of Maryland put subjects in chambers with elevated oxygen concentrations and found it made no difference to yawn frequency whatsoever. Breathing air enriched with carbon dioxide, the gas that actually drives the breathing reflex, also made no difference. Provine tested the two most commonly cited explanations for yawning in controlled conditions, and both failed. The most widely repeated explanation for one of the most universal human behaviors has no experimental support and has had none for nearly 4 decades. What yawning actually does is stranger, more physical, and more directly connected to the temperature of your brain than anyone who taught you about yawning ever mentioned. There is a reason the reflex arrives most reliably in the mid-afternoon, and it has nothing to do with boredom or fatigue. There is a reason it is contagious across species, and the mechanism runs through neural circuitry identical to what transmits empathy. And there is a finding from patients in persistent vegetative states that will reframe what the yawn means about the brainstem itself. All of it comes later. Start with what yawning actually is, because the physics of the gape is the mechanism that makes everything else make sense. Wide opening of the jaw during a yawn is not a passive stretch. It is the active component of a brain cooling system. Andrew Gallup, working first at Princeton and then at SUNY Wananta, spent years testing every proposed function of yawning against experimental data. His most replicated finding, published in 2007 and confirmed across multiple subsequent studies, yawning is a thermoregulatory reflex. The brain is thermally sensitive. Neural processing efficiency degrades measurably as brain temperature rises above its optimal range. And yawning is one of the mechanisms the body uses to correct the temperature before performance declines. Mechanics are specific. Dramatic opening of the jaw stretches the tissues surrounding the internal carotid arteries, the vessels that carry the majority of the blood supply to the brain. The stretch temporarily increases blood flow velocity through these arteries, accelerating the delivery of blood to the cerebral circulation. Simultaneously, the deep inhalation phase of the yawn draws a large volume of cooler ambient air across the nasal mucosa and the blood-rich tissues of the upper pharynx, cooling the venous blood in these regions before it returns to the heart and is recirculated. Combined effect is a rapid pulse of cooled, accelerated blood to the brain, a thermal correction delivered in approximately 6 seconds. Gape is not incidental to the yawn. It is the yawn. The wider the jaw opens, the greater the stretch on the carotid sheath. The stronger the blood flow acceleration, the more effective the cooling pulse. This is why yawns that are suppressed, held back with a closed mouth, feel unsatisfying. Cooling mechanism was initiated but not completed. The brain requested a thermal correction and the social environment prevented it from being delivered. Gallup confirmed the thermoregulation hypothesis with a series of temperature manipulation experiments that no other theory of yawning could have predicted. Subjects who held warm packs to their foreheads yawned significantly more than controls. The local warming of the blood supply to the brain triggered the cooling reflex. Subjects who held cold packs to their foreheads yawned significantly less. The brain was already cool, the reflex was unnecessary. Subjects asked to breathe through their noses yawned less. Because nasal breathing cools blood entering the cerebral circulation more efficiently, reducing the thermal deficit the yawn was being recruited to correct. Intervention that most reliably suppressed yawning was nasal breathing in a cool environment. The intervention that most reliably triggered it was warming the forehead. You can test the second one yourself. On a cool morning, when yawns are infrequent, hold a warm towel against your forehead for 2 minutes. The yawn will arrive, often within 30 seconds of the warmth reaching the skin overlying the frontal bone. No boredom required, no fatigue required, only heat. Oxygen theory predicted none of these results. The boredom theory predicted none of them. The thermoregulation theory predicted all of them. Now, why brain temperature matters enough to warrant a dedicated reflex? Because the thermal physics of the brain explain why the yawn arrives when it does and why suppressing it has consequences. Human brain generates approximately 20 watts of thermal energy continuously, roughly equivalent to a dim incandescent light bulb running inside a sealed, insulated cavity. The brain represents 2% of body mass, but produces 20% of total metabolic heat. That 20 watts must be dissipated continuously or brain temperature rises. To put this in perspective, a laptop computer generates roughly 50 watts and requires a fan, heatsink, and ventilation slots to prevent thermal shutdown. The brain generates 20 watts inside a sealed bone cavity with no ventilation, no fan, and no heatsink, only blood flow. The cooling systems that manage this thermal load are running every second of your life without pause. They are as essential as the heartbeat. A brain without cooling would reach damaging temperatures within minutes. Neural conduction velocity, the speed at which electrical signals travel along axons, is temperature dependent, following the Arrhenius relationship that governs all chemical reaction rates. At the brain's operating temperature of approximately 37 degrees Celsius, neural processing runs at its calibrated speed. Synaptic transmission, neurotransmitter release, ion channel kinetics, all are optimized for this narrow thermal window. As temperature rises above it, even by 1 to 2 degrees, processing speed initially increases but quickly becomes unreliable. Ion channels begin to malfunction. The precise timing of neural firing that underlies cognition, coordination, and sensory processing degrades. Brain does not overheat gracefully. It overheats erratically. Multiple cooling systems operate simultaneously to prevent this. Sweating from the face and scalp, which has a higher density of sweat glands than any other body surface, cools the skin overlying the cranium through evaporative heat loss. The cavernous sinus, a venous structure at the base of the brain where cooled blood from the nasal passages and facial skin mixes with warmer blood draining from the brain, acts as a countercurrent heat exchanger, pre-cooling arterial blood before it enters neural tissue. The internal carotid artery passes directly through the cavernous sinus on its way to the brain, and the cooled venous blood surrounding it extracts heat from the arterial blood through the vessel wall before the arterial blood reaches neural tissue. The anatomy is precise. The artery is literally bathed in cooled venous blood for the final centimeters before it enters the brain. These systems run continuously. They handle the baseline thermal load. But they have limits. During intense cognitive effort, during exercise, during environmental heat exposure, during the circadian temperature peak of the afternoon, the baseline systems reach their capacity and the brain temperature begins to drift upward. Yawning is the on-demand supplement, the thermal correction that fires when the continuous systems are insufficient. It is not the primary cooling mechanism, it is the emergency override. 20 watts of continuous heat, a sealed bone cavity, blood flow as the only coolant, and a 6-second reflex as the emergency backup. Think about the timing. The yawn that arrives mid-afternoon, the one everyone interprets as tiredness or boredom, arrives at the time of day when brain temperature peaks. Core body temperature follows a circadian rhythm, rising through the morning and reaching its daily maximum in the mid to late afternoon. The yawn is the brain requesting a thermal correction at exactly the moment it needs one most. The person who yawns during a 3 o'clock meeting is not demonstrating disengagement. Their brain is running a thermal management protocol that the meeting room's warm, recirculated air has made more necessary. That connection between yawn timing and brain temperature, rather than boredom or fatigue, is the finding that made everything else in the research fall into place for me. Once you see the yawn as a cooling request, the entire pattern becomes legible. Why yawns cluster at state transitions, waking up, falling asleep before a demanding task, when the brain's thermal load is shifting. Why yawns increase in warm rooms and decrease in cool ones. Why fever produces excessive yawning. The brain is overheating and the cooling reflex is firing at maximum rate. Why yawns feel physically compelling in a way that no other reflex except sneezing matches. The urgency is proportional to the thermal deficit the brain is trying to correct. You have experienced the confirmation of this without connecting it to the mechanism. The yawn that arrives when you step from air-conditioned space into summer heat. The yawn that comes during a hot bath. The yawn that reliably precedes the most cognitively demanding part of a task. not because you are losing focus, but because the brain is pre-cooling in anticipation of the increased thermal load that concentrated mental effort will generate. The yawn during the phone call, the difficult chapter, the 20th minute of the warm meeting, all thermal, none of them boredom. The yawn is not a symptom of cognitive decline, it is preparation for cognitive demand. Well, and here is where the reflex becomes something no purely physiological explanation can fully account for. Because yawning is contagious and the contagion mechanism runs through neural circuitry that has nothing to do with temperature, contagious yawning is a separate phenomenon from spontaneous yawning, operating through different neural machinery. The contagion effect is extraordinary in its reach. Reading the word yawn triggers it. Seeing a photograph of someone yawning triggers it. Hearing the sound of a yawn on a recording triggers it. Thinking about yawning, which you may be doing now, triggers it. Approximately 60 to 70% of people yawn within 5 minutes of seeing someone else yawn. The remaining 30 to 40% are not immune. They simply have a higher threshold for the contagion, and repeated exposure will eventually trigger the reflex in most of them. Contagion crosses species boundaries. Chimpanzees yawn contagiously in response to other chimpanzees, documented by Andrew Whiten, and in response to human yawns. Wolves yawn contagiously within their packs, with stronger contagion between wolves that have closer social bonds. Dogs yawn contagiously in response to their owners, more reliably than in response to strangers, suggesting the strength of the contagion tracks the strength of the social bond. The cross-species evidence establishes contagious yawning as an ancient social mechanism rather than a human cultural artifact. Neural pathway runs through the mirror neuron system, the distributed network of neurons that fire both when a person performs an action and when they observe someone else performing it. The mirror system does not distinguish cleanly between self and other at the level of motor preparation. When you watch someone yawn, the brainstem motor nuclei that generate your own yawn undergo sub-threshold activation. They begin preparing the motor program without executing it. In 60 to 70% of cases, the preparation crosses the threshold and the yawn fires. From the perspective of the brainstem, someone else's yawn and your own yawn are nearly indistinguishable events. The boundary between one nervous system and another is, at this level, remarkably permeable. Finding that reframes what contagious yawning means came from Atsushi Senju at Birkbeck College in London. Children with autism spectrum disorder who show reduced empathic mirroring and reduced mirror neuron system activation in response to observed behavior also show significantly reduced susceptibility to contagious yawning. Adults who score higher on validated empathy measures are more susceptible. The correlation is consistent and has been replicated across multiple studies. Implication runs in both directions. High susceptibility to yawn contagion is a marker of strong empathic circuitry. Low susceptibility may indicate reduced empathic mirroring, not as a pathology necessarily, but as a measurable variation in how strongly one nervous system models the internal state of another. The next time someone in a room yawns and you feel the reflex arriving in your own jaw, that pull, that inevitability, that sense that your body is about to do something, your mind did not decide. You are feeling your mirror neuron system running someone else's motor program through your own brainstem. The strength of the pull is proportional to the strength of the empathic connection. Yawning is the only known reflex that is specifically transmitted through empathy circuitry, not through proximity, not through air quality, through the neural machinery that allows one nervous system to model the internal state of another. The person who yawns when you yawn is not imitating you. They are running your motor program through their own brainstem because their empathy circuitry made the boundary between your body and theirs temporarily transparent. Contagion is stronger between people with closer social bonds, partners more than colleagues, friends more than strangers, and the couple who yawn in synchrony across a room are demonstrating, in 6 seconds, that their mirror neuron systems are calibrated closely enough for one brainstem's thermal request to propagate automatically into the others. Let that settle. The same neural system that allows you to feel something of another person's pain, to mirror their emotional state, to understand their experience through simulation rather than observation. That system, is what makes their yawn propagate into your body. The yawn contagion is a readout of empathic capacity. The person who never catches yawns is not disciplined. They may be less empathically connected to the person yawning. Why does the reflex exist as this particular dramatic motor program? Thermoregulation explains what yawning does. It does not fully explain why brain cooling is implemented as a conspicuous, whole-body event visible to others at distance, rather than as a quiet vascular adjustment nobody would notice. One evolutionary hypothesis suggests that conspicuousness is the point. Yawning signals to the social group that an individual is transitioning between alertness states. From sleep to waking, from sustained attention to fatigue, from low demand to high demand. The contagious nature of the reflex propagates the state transition across the group, coordinating alertness levels at moments when group coordination matters most. A yawn rippling through a troop of primates at dusk is not collective boredom. It is a coordinated state transition, the group synchronizing its shift from daytime alertness to nighttime vigilance through a reflex that one nervous system broadcasts and others receive through empathy circuitry. Signaling function and cooling function are not competing explanations. They are layered. The cooling mechanism does the physiological work, the conspicuousness does the social work, and the contagion ensures the group transitions together. The yawn is simultaneously a maintenance event for the individual brain and a coordination signal for the group, both functions running through one 6-second motor program. The contagion runs through social circuitry, the next function runs through fluid. Now, beyond temperature, the yawn is doing something mechanical to the fluid that bathes the brain. Deep inhalation phase of a yawn produces a dramatic pressure change in the thoracic cavity, a pressure shift large enough to make your ears pop during the reflex. This pressure change propagates through the venous system and produces a measurable surge in cerebrospinal fluid flow through the cerebral ventricles and spinal column. Phase contrast MRI studies have documented that the CSF pulse associated with yawning is significantly larger than the CSF pulse produced by normal breathing. Cerebrospinal fluid is not just a cushion, it is a drainage and waste clearance system. A waste clearance pathway for the brain was identified in 2012. Nettergaard at the University of Rochester showed that CSF flowing through perivascular channels flushes metabolic waste products from the brain during sleep. Primary waste product cleared is amyloid beta, the protein aggregate that accumulates in Alzheimer's disease and that the brain produces continuously as a byproduct of normal neural activity. Every brain produces amyloid beta. The question is whether the clearance systems remove it fast enough to prevent accumulation. Glymphatic clearance operates primarily during sleep, when the brain's interstitial spaces expand by approximately 60%, allowing CSF to flow more freely through the tissue and carry waste toward the venous drainage. This is one of the reasons sleep deprivation is associated with accelerated amyloid beta accumulation. The clearance window is shortened. The waste builds faster than it is removed. Yawn-driven CSF pulse may represent a daytime supplement to this clearance mechanism. A brief glymphatic flush triggered by the brainstem reflex that also manages brain temperature. The research is early. The connection between yawning and amyloid beta clearance has not been directly measured. But the mechanism is real. The CSF pulse is documented, the glymphatic pathway is established, and the yawn produces a larger pulse than normal respiration. The implication is worth stating precisely. Yawning may be doing, in brief pulses during waking hours, something related to what sleep does over 8 hours. Not at the same scale, not with the same efficiency, but through identical fluid, through identical channels, clearing identical waste. You see, the yawn is doing still more. Because the motor program involves structures far beyond the jaw. Tensor tympani, one of 2 small muscles in the middle ear, contracts reflexively during the jaw-opening phase of the yawn as part of the coordinated motor program. This contraction changes the tension on the tympanic membrane and briefly alters middle ear pressure, producing the characteristic ear-popping sensation. Eustachian tube opens. Pressure between the middle ear and the external environment equalizes. In conditions of pressure change, aircraft descent, driving through altitude shifts, Yawning is one of the most effective mechanisms for middle ear equalization, more reliable for many people than swallowing alone. Stretch that often accompanies yawning: the raising of the arms, the arching of the back, the extension of the limbs, is called pendiculation. It is not a separate behavior appended to the yawn. It is part of this coordinated motor program, and it serves a specific proprioceptive function. The sustained contraction and release resets the sensitivity of the muscle spindles, the proprioceptive organs embedded in skeletal muscle that report length, tension, and position to the somatosensory cortex. After a period of sustained posture, sitting at a desk, lying in bed, holding any position for an extended duration, the muscle spindles adapt to the maintained position and their sensitivity decreases. They report less information about stretch and tension because they have habituated to the static load. Pendiculation reverses this. The forceful contraction followed by release drives the spindles through their full range, resetting their sensitivity and restoring accurate proprioceptive reporting to the brain. This is why the morning yawn stretch feels necessary rather than optional. The body has been in a sustained posture for 7 or 8 hours, and the proprioceptive system has adapted to the lying position. The pendiculation that accompanies the first yawn of the day is recalibrating the entire proprioceptive map. Without it, the first movements of the day would be less coordinated, less accurate, and more likely to produce the stiffness and clumsiness that people associate with not being fully awake. The stiffness is real. The pendiculation addresses it at the sensor level. Yawn. Stretch combination is a full system recalibration completed in approximately 6 seconds. Brain temperature corrected, CSF pulsed through the ventricles, middle ear pressure equalized, and muscle spindle sensitivity restored across the major muscle groups. 4 maintenance functions coordinated by a single brainstem motor program. No other reflex in the human body accomplishes this many simultaneous functions in this short a duration. Now, why the reflex declines with age? Because the mechanism behind the decline connects yawning to the neural changes that govern sleep, memory, and autonomic regulation. Yawn frequency declines progressively with age. The mechanism is not fully established, but the strongest evidence points to changes in the cholinergic system. The neurotransmitter acetylcholine governs the brainstem reflex circuits that generate yawning, and cholinergic function declines across the lifespan. The decline is implicated equally in reduced REM sleep duration, impaired memory consolidation, and the autonomic changes of normal aging. Certain medications common in older adults accelerate this decline. Anticholinergic drugs, prescribed for bladder overactivity, included in some antihistamines, present in some antidepressants and sleep aids, directly suppress yawning by blocking the acetylcholine receptors the reflex depends on. A person taking an anticholinergic medication may notice they yawn less frequently without connecting the change to the drug. The reduction in yawning is rarely noted as a side effect because yawning is not considered a clinically important behavior. But if yawning serves the thermoregulatory, CSF clearance, and proprioceptive functions the research describes, then suppressing it pharmacologically is suppressing a maintenance program the brain relies on, an unintended consequence of a drug prescribed for an unrelated condition. Clinical observation is suggestive. Reduced spontaneous yawning correlates with certain neurological conditions, including early Parkinson's disease and some presentations of multiple sclerosis. Some neurologists have considered yawn frequency as a potential marker of brainstem cholinergic function, not yet validated as a clinical tool, but the correlation is consistent across observational studies. Think about what this means. The brainstem reflex that has been cooling your brain, pulsing your CSF, equalizing your ear pressure, and recalibrating your muscle spindles since before you were born. Yawning is documented by ultrasound in human fetuses from approximately 11 weeks of gestation, months before the lungs are functional, months before the first breath. The jaw opening and closing in a motor program rehearsal that has no thermal function yet, but is already wired into the brainstem circuitry that will run it for the next 8 decades, is declining as you age, driven by cholinergic changes affecting your sleep architecture, your memory consolidation, and your autonomic flexibility. The yawn is not trivial. Its decline is a signal about the neural machinery governing some of the most consequential functions the aging brain performs. And you have been suppressing it in meetings for 40 years. The social prohibition against visible yawning, in meetings, in classrooms, in religious services, in conversation, creates a physiological conflict. The person experiencing it has no way to evaluate. Suppressing a yawn requires sustained contraction of the jaw and throat muscles, which partially counteracts the pressure differential the reflex was generating. The cooling pulse is attenuated. The CSF surge is reduced. The ear pressure equalization does not complete. The pendiculation is inhibited entirely. The context where the brain works hardest and generates the most heat, the warm meeting room, the sustained lecture, the cognitively demanding afternoon, are the contexts where the social penalty for yawning is highest. The reflex is most aggressively suppressed in the environments where the brain most needs it to complete. The room that penalized the yawn believed it signaled boredom, disinterest, or insufficient sleep. The brainstem that generated it was running a thermal correction, a fluid clearance pulse, a pressure equalization, and a proprioceptive recalibration. Simultaneously, in 6 seconds, on a schedule it is maintained since the 11th week of gestation. And here is what sits at the bottom of everything else. The observation that reveals what the yawn means about the brainstem itself. Oliver Wolosinski documented that yawning persists in patients in persistent vegetative states. Individuals with severely damaged cortex but intact brainstem function. The cortex is gone. Consciousness is gone. Language, memory, identity, the capacity to recognize a face or form a thought, all destroyed, and the yawn continues, spontaneously, sometimes contagiously. The brainstem of a vegetative patient can mirror a yawn, observed by eyes that cannot consciously process what they are seeing. Wolosinski's documentation stopped everything else I was reading, because it strips the reflex down to its most fundamental layer. If the yawn were about boredom, it would require a cortex capable of being bored. If it were about oxygen, it would respond to oxygen levels, which Provine showed it does not. If it were about social signaling alone, it would require social awareness. The yawn in the vegetative patient has none of these. It has a brainstem, a jaw, and a thermal regulation requirement. Everything else has been destroyed, and the reflex persists. The yawn survives the destruction of virtually everything that makes a person consciously present. It is one of the most ancient reflexes in the vertebrate brainstem, present in fish, in reptiles, in birds, and every mammal that has been studied. Fossils of early tetrapods showed jaw structures consistent with the yawning motor program, suggesting the reflex predates the emergence of mammals by hundreds of millions of years. It runs below the level of personality, below the level of awareness, below the level of everything that constitutes the self, still cooling the brain, still pulsing the cerebrospinal fluid, still equalizing middle ear pressure, in a body whose conscious mind has departed. That finding does not make yawning more important than it was. It reveals how important it always was. The brainstem operates on priorities. When resources are limited, it preserves the reflexes it cannot afford to lose and abandons those it can. A reflex that the brainstem preserves when it has lost everything else is a reflex at the top of the priority list. Oxygen explanation is wrong. The boredom theory is incomplete. What the brainstem has been running, in every vertebrate that has ever existed, in every human who has ever sat in a room and felt the reflex arrive and held it back, is a maintenance program so fundamental that it survives the destruction of the cortex, so ancient that it predates the evolution of consciousness, and so misunderstood that the species has spent centuries penalizing it on the basis of an explanation that was disproved in 1987. Tomorrow, when the yawn arrives, in a conversation, in a meeting, in a quiet room where no one is watching, it will arrive because the brainstem measured a thermal deficit in the cerebral blood supply and initiated a 6-second correction that also pulses cerebrospinal fluid, equalizes middle ear pressure, and recalibrates the proprioceptive system. It will arrive on a schedule that began at 11 weeks of gestation. It will arrive through circuitry so fundamental that it would continue running if everything above the brainstem were destroyed. The yawn was never rude. It was never about oxygen. It was the brain maintaining itself on schedule, whether anyone understood what it was doing or not.